Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to discuss Slavoj Zizek's book, Violence. Now, he calls this 6 sideways reflections, and it's just 6 chapters talking about different aspects of violence, talking about its legitimation, about the difference between different kinds of violence, the extent to which we might be able to legitimate certain forms, and also how other forms can become legitimating mechanisms for very problematic institutions. And ultimately, perhaps his most provocative claim is the very end. Sometimes doing nothing is the most violent thing to do. And this kind of rubs me two ways. In one way, it's very interesting because oftentimes what we perceive to be the most effective means of violence are actually the most complacent. And then on the other hand, that statement itself can be a deep form of complacency. But Zizek is reacting, of course, to the failure of various countercultural movements in Europe and America in the late 60s and early 70s, with the kind of totalizing world order that is the US-China polarization that has kind of replaced the US-Soviet Union polarization. And in this book, I'm just going to be I'll be going through some of the stuff that I found the most interesting and just kind of give you an honest take of what's going on in this book. It's only about 200 pages, so it's not a very long read, and Zizek certainly is good at telling stories, bringing you into lots of different we're talking about Abu Ghraib, we're talking about 9/11, we're talking about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, all this stuff. So very interesting indeed. Now, Zizek opens by talking about one of the forms of violence that he sees as a sort of cloaked violence, which is what he calls liberal communists. And he classifies people like Jeff Bezos as being in this category. They contribute very profoundly to cycles of violence in the world through the legitimation of certain capitalist means, and yet they give off the air of being a humanitarian, being, subject to these benevolent ideals. And he links this to Nietzsche's concept of the last man, saying Western civilization was moving in the direction of the last man, an apathetic caricature with no great passion or commitment. Unable to dream, tired of life, he takes no risks, seeking only comfort and security, an expression of tolerance with one another. And he quotes Nietzsche from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "A little poison now and then, that makes for pleasant dreams, and much poison at the end for a pleasant death. They have their little pleasures for the day and their little pleasures for the night, but they have a regard for health. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and they blink." So what he's saying here, a la Nietzsche, is that we enter this cycle of complacency whereby we can feel as if we've reached some profound salvation, where in fact we've just stumbled into a cycle of complacency. Zizek says that we live in a society where a kind of Hegelian speculative identity of opposites exists. Certain features, attitudes, and norms of life are no longer perceived as ideologically marked. They appear to be neutral, non-ideological, natural, commonsensical. We designate as ideology that which stands out from this background. Extreme religious zeal or dedication to a particular political organization. The Hegelian point here would be that it is precisely the neutralization of some features into a spontaneously accepted background that marks out ideology at its purest and its most effective. This is the dialectical coincidence of opposites. The actualization of a notion or an ideology at its purest coincides with, or more precisely appears as its opposite, as non-ideology. Mutatis mutandis, the same holds for violence. Social symbolic violence at its purest appears as its opposite, as the spontaneity of the milieu in which we dwell, of the air we breathe, right? So there's this sort of force that is permeating society itself. And he says this is why the delicate liberal communist frightened, caring, fighting violence and the blind fundamentalist exploding in rage are two sides of the same coin. While they fight subjective violence, liberal communists are the very agents of the structural violence which creates the conditions for the explosions of subjective violence. The same philanthropists who give millions for AIDS or education and tolerance have ruined the lives of thousands through financial speculation and thus created the conditions for the rise of the very intolerance that is being fought. That's really important because he's trying to figure out, okay, how do we get rid of this superfluous violence such as Islamic fundamentalism, which is just feeding into this cycle of meaningless reactionary violence, and get to something that's actually going to change society for the better? Because as a sort of one of the more famous communist/Marxist intellectuals of our day, Zizek is trying to maintain that Marxist and indeed Hegelian project of finding legitimate ways to progress in world history, Weltgeschichte, as Hegel put it. And Zizek says that indeed, what to do with a man who cannot be bought by the corporate interests because he co-owns the corporation, who holds to what he says about fighting poverty because he profits by it, who honestly expresses his opinion because he's so powerful that he can afford to, who is brave and wise and ruthlessly pursuing his enterprises and does not consider his personal advantages since all his needs have already been satisfied. And who, furthermore, is a good friend, particularly of his Davos colleagues. Bertolt Brecht provided an answer in his poem, The Interrogation of the Good. Step forward. We hear that you are a good man. You cannot be bought, but the lightning which strikes the house also cannot be bought. You hold to what you said, but what did you say? You are honest. You say your opinion. Which opinion? You're brave. Against whom? You're wise. For whom? You do not consider your personal advantages. Whose advantages do you consider then? You are a good friend. Are you also a good friend of the good people? Hear us then. We know you are our enemy. This is why we shall now put you in front of a wall. But in consideration of your merits and good qualities, we shall put you in front of a good wall and shoot you with a good bullet, with a good gun, and bury you with a good shovel in the good earth. Which is kind of a very frivolous and funny joke, but the point, of course, is that we tend to be subservient to people who claim to be, of course, acting on behalf of our interests, where in fact they are the very people who are causing society to be in such a way. Now, in chapter 2, he starts talking about fear thy neighbor as thyself, and he starts talking about the role of fear in these legitimating structures of violence. He says, Kant was already well aware of this paradox when he developed his notion of enthusiasm for the French Revolution in his Conflict of Faculties from 1795. The revolution's true significance does not reside in what actually went on in Paris, much of what was terrifying and included outbursts of murderous passion, but in the enthusiastic response that the events in Paris generated in the eyes of sympathetic observers all around Europe. He quotes Kant here, the recent revolution of a people which is rich in spirit may well either fail or succeed, accumulate misery and atrocity, but nevertheless arouses in the heart of all spectators, who are not themselves caught up in it, a taking of sides according to desires, which borders on enthusiasm, and which, since its very expression was not without danger, can only have been caused by a moral disposition within the human race. This is very interesting. Finding ways of supporting a political program or plan of action, no matter what the outcomes are. It's almost as if, once you become partial to something, then, it doesn't really matter the content, but the form of what's occurring, what it represents. Zizek says that to translate this into Lacanian language, the real event, the very dimension of the real, was not in the immediate reality of the violent event in Paris, but in how this reality appeared to observers and in the hopes thus awakened in them, which is an important dimension to keep in mind when it comes to facilitating the legitimation of violence. He says, the Soviet experience of building socialism in one country certainly did accumulate misery and atrocity, but it nevertheless aroused enthusiasm in the heart of the spectators, who were not themselves caught up in that. That's important, that detachment where you can say something good about something bad that was happening to people. The question here is, does every ethics have to rely on such a gesture of fetishistic disavowal? This is important, I think one of Zizek's better points. Is even the most universal ethics not obliged to draw a line and ignore some sort of suffering? What about animals slaughtered for our own consumption? Who among us would be able to continue eating pork chops after visiting a factory farm in which pigs are half bred and half blinked and half blind and cannot even properly walk, but are just fattened to be killed? And what about, say, torture and suffering of millions we know about but choose to ignore? Imagine the effect of having to watch a snuff movie portraying what goes on thousands of times a day around the world. Brutal acts of torture, the picking out of eyes, the crushing of testicles, the list cannot bear being recounted. Would the watcher be able to continue going on as usual? Yes, but only if he or she were able somehow to forget, in an act which suspended symbolic efficiency, what had been witnessed. This forgetting entails a gesture of what is called fetishistic disavowal. I know, but I don't want to know, so I don't know. I know it, but I refuse to fully assume the consequences of this knowledge so that I can continue acting as if I don't know it. That's important, right? It's like the fact how us in the U.S., we know our vote doesn't matter. We know that our political spectrum vacillates between two parties, neither of which genuinely care for our interests, but we choose the lesser of the two evils because, they pander to our immediate fears of, for example, a national abortion ban. We know this kind of stuff happens, but we kind of lie to ourselves that it's not really what's occurring. He says it becomes clear that every ethics may well have to rely on just this gesture of fetishistic disavowal. Even the apparently obvious exception, the Buddhist ethics of solidarity with every living being, falls into this picture. After all, what Buddhism offers as a solution is a universalized indifference, a learning of how to withdraw too much empathy. This is why Buddhism can so easily turn into the very opposite of universal compassion, the advocacy of a ruthless military attitude. So that's very interesting, and I think that's one of the things that, of course, we in modern society kind of struggle from, is this detachment, which leads to the quick instrumentalization of violence as what Zizek will later designate as a passage à l'acte, a just sort of momentary blip in history to try to effectuate some change, but which in fact is a very reactionary way of approaching change, the likes of that we saw in 9/11 and other acts of Islamic fundamentalism. He says, what if that which appears as an inconsistency, as the failure to draw all the consequences from one's ethical attitude, is, on the contrary, its positive condition of possibility? What if such an exclusion of some form of otherness from the scope of our ethical concerns is consubstantial with the very founding gesture of ethical universality, so that the more universal our explicit ethics is, the more brutal the underlying exclusion is? This is definitely, and I know Zizek wouldn't like this because he critiques Butler at some points, but this is exactly what Judith Butler says in Gender Trouble when she says, what if it is the case that a universal essence of femininity, of what it means to be a woman, may paradoxically undercut feminists' desire for representation? Because, of course, by restricting our group, we are effectively guaranteeing that some people will not be represented. Zizek continues, what the Christian all-inclusive attitude, recall St. Paul's famous "there are no men or women, no Jews or Greeks," involves is a thorough exclusion of those who do not accept inclusion into the Christian community. In other particularistic religions, and even in Islam, in spite of its globalistic expansionism, there is a place for others. They're tolerated, even if they are looked upon with condescension. The Christian motto, all men are brothers, however, also means that those who do not accept brotherhood are not men. In the early years of the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini played on the same paradox when he claimed in an interview for the Western press that the Iranian Revolution was the most humane in all of history. Not a single person was killed by the revolutionaries. When the surprised journalist asked about the death penalties publicized in the media, Khomeini calmly replied, "Those that we killed were not men, but criminal dogs." Christians usually praise themselves for overcoming the Jewish exclusivist notion of the chosen people and encompassing the entirety of humanity. The catch is that, in their very insistence that they are the chosen people with a privileged direct link to God, Jews accept the humanity of the other people who celebrate their false gods, while Christian universalism tendentiously excludes non-believers from the very universality of humankind. And I think that's important. What he's getting at is a notion of ethical universalism, what she's going to go into when he talks about toleration. That maybe this is not the best way, that this kind of universal egalitarianism, maybe this is not the best way to think about our political and ethical projects, because it's naturally going to legitimize universal forms of exclusion, because universal inclusion and exclusion in a properly Hegelian sense are two sides of the same coin, part of the same sublatory act. He says, when we perceive something as an act of violence, we measure it by a presupposed standard of what the normal nonviolent situation is. And the highest form of violence is the imposition of the standard with reference to what some events appear as violent. Once again, this is exactly what Foucault and Judith Butler and Deleuze are saying in their work, that what is the most violent imposition is the very insistence on essences, on this notion of identity as absolute, because that itself is bent on the pre-existing existence of identity, which is then imposed in the case of gender or sexual identity or political or whatever it may be. Zizek says that this is why language itself, the very medium of nonviolence, of mutual recognition, involves unconditional violence. In other words, it is language itself which pushes our desire beyond proper limits, transforming it into a desire that contains the infinite, elevating it into an absolute striving that cannot ever be satisfied. What Lacan calls objet petit a is precisely this ethereal undead object, the surplus object that causes desire in its excessive and derailing aspect. One cannot get rid of this excess. It is consubstantial with human desire as such. That's certainly very interesting, right? That language itself, through its imposition of categories and norms, is itself a form of violence. This is something that Foucault and Deleuze and Baudrillard are all going to be talking about. So very interesting. And he kind of takes this into the notion of reason and race. And I'm hearkened back to one of my favorite books on the subject, my professor Deborah K. Heikes's book, Rationality, Representation, and Race. A really, really good book in which she details the link between rationality as a race-based category and thus an exclusionary category itself. He says, so perhaps the fact that reason and race have the same root in Latin, ratio, tells us something. Language, not primitive egotistic interest, is the first and greatest divider. It is because of language that we and our neighbors can live in different worlds even while living on the same street. And this, to me, applies to the internet as well, with our closeness, which precludes that very closeness. What this means is that verbal violence is not a secondary distortion, but the ultimate resort of every specifically human violence. Take the example of anti-Semitic pogroms, which can stand in for all racist violence. What the perpetrators of pogroms find intolerable and rage-provoking, what they react to is not the immediate reality of Jews, but the image or figure of the Jew, which circulates and has been constructed in their tradition. The catch, of course, is that one single individual cannot distinguish in any simple way between real Jews and their anti-Semitic image. This image overdetermines the way I experience real Jews themselves, and furthermore, it affects the way Jews experience themselves. What makes a real Jew that an anti-Semite encounters on the street intolerable? What the anti-Semite tries to destroy when he attacks the Jew, the true target of his fury, is this phantasmatic dimension. And the phantasmatic is really important because the spectacle, as he's saying, and this is something Baudrillard focuses on, actually over-determines the reality, such that symbolic violence can sometimes be more detrimental than real violence because it acts as a legitimating project for future violence. And Zizek, in kind of line with caricaturing Kant, talks about some antinomies of tolerant reason, because Kant's antinomies are a section of the Critique of Pure Reason where he talks about, does the universe have a beginning in time or not, a beginning in space or not, and other sorts of questions. And he shows how you can give equally logically consistent arguments to either side of this, such that these antinomies show the limit of human reason, what we can effectively talk about. And Zizek states that there are similar things that can be done in ethics. Particularly, he wants to talk about this in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, because in here he sees a way to, for example, weaponize the Holocaust that can work one of two ways, such that you can kind of have two different kinds of anti-Semitism that are both their own forms of the legitimation of atrocities. And he mentions how, for example, the problem at the moment is that the state of Israel, though continually victorious, still relies on the image of Jews as victims to legitimize its power politics, as well as to denounce its critics as covert Holocaust sympathizers. And he quotes Arthur Koestler here, "If power corrupts, the reverse is also true. Persecution corrupts the victims, though perhaps in subtler and more tragic ways." Zizek continues, "This is the fatal flaw in the one strong argument for the creation of a Jewish nation-state after the Holocaust. In creating their own state, the Jews would overcome the situation of being delivered up to the mercy of the diaspora states and the tolerance or intolerance of their nation's majority. Although this line of argument is different from the religious one, it has to rely on religious tradition to justify the geographical location of this new state. I think of the fact that, for example, Argentina was a proposed location for a Jewish nation state. Otherwise, Zizek says, one finds oneself in the situation of the old joke about a madman looking for his lost wallet under the streetlight and not in the dark corner where he had lost it, because one sees better under the light. Because it was easier, the Jews took land from the Palestinians and not from those who caused them so much suffering and thus owed them reparation." That's really interesting. Taking this victim position, yet not necessarily demanding reparations from those who committed the crimes, but from the innocent. He gives a very interesting kind of solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I think is worth entertaining. He says, "So to the big question, what would be a truly radical ethico-political act today in the Middle East? For both Israelis and Arabs, it would consist in the gesture of renouncing political control of Jerusalem, that is, of endorsing the transformation of the old town of Jerusalem into an extra-state place of religious worship controlled temporarily by some neutral international force. What both sides should accept is that by renouncing political control of Jerusalem, they are effectively renouncing nothing. They are gaining the elevation of Jerusalem into a genuinely extra-political sacred site, which is exactly what both sides claim that it is. What they would lose is precisely and only what already in itself deserves to be lost, the reduction of religion to a stake in political power play. This would be a true event in the Middle East, the explosion of true political universality in the Paulinian sense of there are for us neither Jew nor Palestinians. Each of the two sides would have to realize that this renunciation of the ethically pure nation-state is a liberation for themselves, not simply a sacrifice to be made for the other." Now, it might strike one as an idealistic solution, and maybe in fact it is, but it's certainly interesting to think about the ways in which this religious exclusionary mindset actually furthers the ability of religion to cause violence. He says, today, as religion emerges as the main source of murderous violence around the world, one grows tired of the constant assurances that Christian, Muslim, or Hindu fundamentalists are only abusing and perverting the noble spiritual message of their creed. Isn't it time to restore the dignity of atheism, perhaps our only chance for peace? As a rule, where religiously inspired violence is concerned, we put the blame on violence itself. It is the violent or terrorist political agent who misuses a noble religion, so the goal becomes to retrieve the authentic core of religion from its political instrumentalization. What, however, if one should take the risk of inverting this relationship? What if what appears as a moderating force, that being religion, compelling us to control our violence, is its secret instigator? And this is part and parcel of Zizek's critique here, is that the mechanisms that we think are acting as fetters for violence, such as nonviolence campaigns, are actually forces of legitimation for it. What if then, instead of renouncing violence, one were to renounce religion, including its secular reverberations, such as Stalinist communism with its reliance on the historical big other, and to pursue violence on its own, assuming full responsibility for it, without any cover-up in some figure of the big other? And he continues that what complicates all this today is that mass killings are more and more legitimated in religious terms, while pacifism is predominantly atheistic. It is the very belief in a higher divine goal which allows us to instrumentalize individuals, while atheism admits no such goal and thus refuses all forms of sacred sacrificing. And it should be noted that this doesn't mean that atheists will not instrumentalize individuals. They will, as the strange Christian atheist or Christian secular kind of coincidence of the U.S. happens. We have these secular economic forces of capitalism coinciding with a tremendous level of Christian religiosity. And this leads us to some strange instances where we have both religion and secularity working together. And he says, no wonder then that as AP reported on the 12th of November 2006, Elton John, while admiring the teachings of Christ and other spiritual leaders, opposes all organized religion. Quote, I think religion has always tried to turn hatred towards gay people, Elton said in the Observer newspaper's music supplement. Religion promotes the hatred and spite against gays, from my point of view. I would ban religion completely. Organized religion doesn't seem to work. It turns people into really hateful lemmings, and it's not really compassionate, which is very true. It is a faux form of compassion that, in fact, is just the selective delivering of compassion to those who are within the fold, for example. And I think Zizek really hits it on the head with regards to fundamentalism here. He says the majority needs to be anesthetized against their elementary sensitivity to the other's suffering. And for this, a sacred cause is needed. More than a century ago, in his Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky warned against the dangers of godless moral nihilism. If God doesn't exist, then anything is permissible. The French New philosopher André Glucksmann applied Dostoevsky's critique of godless nihilism to 9/11, as the title of his book, Dostoevsky in Manhattan, suggests. He couldn't have been more wrong. The lesson of today's terrorism is that if there is a God, then everything, even blowing up hundreds of innocent bystanders, is permitted to those who claim to act directly on behalf of God, as the instruments of his will, since clearly a direct link to God justifies our violation of any merely human constraints and consideration. The godless Stalinist communists are the ultimate proof of it. Everything was permitted to them, since they perceived themselves as direct instruments of their divinity, the historical necessity of progress towards communism. This is a really funny thing because, oftentimes there's this sort of battle back and forth of have the Christians or the atheists caused the most suffering in the world, which is an interesting hill to die on. And it's often pointed to people like Stalin as, this is the outcome of atheism. Look at them. They were all for this militant atheism. But if you look at the actual structural and formal qualities of the Soviet Union, it was on the back of profoundly religious impulses. The personality cult is a staple of religion and doesn't really make sense in atheism insofar as it is a profoundly religious impulse to worship, to bow down, and as we've talked about earlier with Kant's quotes, to just sort of write off the actual content of what occurs and just be satisfied with the form. Zizek says the formula of the fundamentalist religious supposition of the ethical was proposed by Augustine, who wrote, "Love God and do as you please." Alternatively, this becomes love and do whatever you want, since from the Christian perspective, the two ultimately amount to the same thing. God, after all, is love. The catch, of course, is that if you really love God, you will want what he wants. What pleases him will please you, and what displeases him will make you miserable. So it is not that you can just do whatever you want. Your love for God, if true, guarantees that in what you will do, you will follow the highest ethical standards. This is a little bit like the proverbial joke, my fiancée is never late for an appointment because when she's late, she's no longer my fiancée. If you love God, you can do whatever you want because when you do something evil, this is in itself a proof that you do not really love God. However, the ambiguity persists since there is no guarantee external to your belief of what God really wants you to do. In the absence of any ethical standards external to your belief in and love for God, the danger is always lurking that you will use your love of God as the legitimization of the most horrible deeds. And this is an important thing that Zizek is trying to focus on in this book, is the way certain structures can make us blind to the content of our world, make us fail to realize, for example, the reliance of our condition on material conditions and not just abstract ideologies, that if we actually realize these structures, we might have some sort of effective outcome. Because as he says, fundamentalists do whatever they perceive as good deeds in order to fulfill God's will and deserve salvation. But atheists do them simply because it is the right thing to do. Is this also not our most elementary experience of morality? When I do a good deed, I do not do it with the view of attaining God's favor. I do it because I cannot do otherwise. If I were not to do it, I would not be able to look at myself in the mirror. It's intolerable to my conscience. The 18th century economist philosopher David Hume, a believer, made this point in a very poignant way when he wrote that the only way to show a true respect for God is to act morally while ignoring God's existence. The history of European atheism, from its Greek and Roman origins in Lucretius's De Rerum Natura to modern classics like Spinoza, offers a lesson in dignity and courage. Much more than with occasional outbursts of hedonism, it is marked by the awareness of the bitter outcome of every human life, since there is no higher authority watching over our fates and guaranteeing the happy outcome. At the same time, atheists strive to formulate the message of joy which comes not from escaping reality, but from accepting it and creatively finding one's place in it. What makes the materialist tradition unique is the way it combines the humble awareness that we are not masters of the universe, but just parts of a much larger whole exposed to contingent twists of fate, with a readiness to accept the heavy burden of responsibility for what we make out of our lives. With the threat of unpredictable catastrophe looming from all sides, isn't this an attitude needed more than ever in our own times? I think that's a very interesting case of a genuine effectiveness of responsibility. Oftentimes I'm kind of wary when someone talks about responsibility because I'm kind of watching for the ideological undertones there, but this is really what seems to me a post-ideological approach to responsibility, which Zizek would probably cringe at the idea of post-ideology. But he says, it is easy to render this liberal notion of tolerance, which he's so critical of, problematic, and to render palpable the violence that sustains it. Firstly, it is not truly universal, kulturelos, without culture, since in our societies a gendered division of labor still predominates, which confers a male twist on basic liberal categories, autonomy, public activity, competition, and relegates women to the private sphere of family solidarity. Liberalism itself, in its opposition of private and public, harbors male dominance. Furthermore, it is only modern Western capitalist culture for which autonomy and individual freedom stand higher than collective solidarity, connection, responsibility for, and dependence on others, the duty to respect the customs of one's community. Liberalism itself thus privileges a certain culture, the modern Western one. As to freedom of choice, liberalism is also marked by a strong bias. It is intolerant when individuals of other cultures are not given freedom of choice, as is evident in issues such as clitoridectomy, child brideship, infanticide, polygamy, and incest. However, it ignores the tremendous pressure which, for example, compels women in our liberal society to undergo such procedures as plastic surgery, cosmetic implants, and Botox injections in order to remain competitive in the sex market. And this is interesting because I don't think Zizek's trying to say that these are qualitatively the same. Obviously, clitoridectomy versus Botox are two very different regimes, but I think what Zizek is trying to say is that they are both just different forms of legitimating oppression, exclusion, selection of certain ideal parts of oneself. With regards to universality, Zizek says, actual universality is not the deep feeling that above all differences, different civilizations share the same basic values, etc. Actual universality actualizes itself as the experience of negativity, of the inadequacy to itself of a particular identity. The formula of revolutionary solidarity is not let us tolerate our differences. It is not a pact of civilizations, but a pact of struggles which cut across civilizations, a pact between what in each civilization undermines its identity from within, fights against its oppressive kernel. What unites us is the same struggle. A better formula would thus be, in spite of our differences, we can identify the basic antagonism or antagonistic struggle in which we're both caught. So let us share our intolerance and join forces in the same struggle. I think that's interesting because Zizek is trying to point out that intolerance is actually an effective kind of mechanism by which historical change can be actualized. This is the sort of tension that we see in Hegelian dialectics that brings forward history, and it's present in Marxism too. In other words, in the emancipatory struggle, it is not the cultures in their identity which join hands. It is the repressed, the exploited which join hands. It is the repressed, the parts of no part of every culture which come together in a shared struggle. And I think it's particularly important to note that this struggle is not an identical, self-same struggle in content. It's in its form, which is important for Zizek. The ways in which these structures legitimate certain forms of oppression. In the epilogue, he has some really good stuff to say. He says, the characterization of Hitler, which would have him as a bad guy responsible for the deaths of millions, but nonetheless a man with balls who pursued his ends with an iron will, is not only ethically repulsive, but false. No, Hitler did not have the balls really to change things. All his actions were fundamentally reactions. He acted so that nothing would really change. He acted to prevent the communist threat of real change. His targeting of the Jews was ultimately an act of displacement in which he avoided the real enemy, the core of capitalist social relations themselves. Hitler staged a spectacle of revolution so that the capitalist order could survive. The irony was that his grand gestures of despising bourgeois self-complacency ultimately enabled this complacency to continue. Far from disturbing the much-despised decadent bourgeois order, far from awakening the Germans, Nazism was a dream which enabled them to postpone awakening. Germany only really woke up with the defeat of 1945. And I think that's a profound lesson that we can all have of, for example, there's like a tremendous resurgence in the legitimation of what Hitler did, that he was a powerful leader. I was just watching a video the other day, someone doing like a travel vlog, and one of their drivers in Uganda had on his vehicle a sticker of Hitler, and he was like, he was a good, strong leader. He's who we need. He also had a sticker of Idi Amin on there, so that tells you a lot of this guy's ignorance. But I think it's a good thing in this 6 sideways reflections, it's a good thing to reflect on the role of violence and its legitimation. This is an interesting read, kind of, drawing on lots of different figures. I wouldn't say it's particularly novel, because I feel like you could find a lot of these insights in Deleuze or Foucault or Marx or Hegel, but nevertheless, an interesting read. He's good at kind of getting things into a concise manner. So that being said, I hope this has been interesting, somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you need help with some reading, or you want to talk about a philosophy problem. I also have super thanks available if you'd like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and as a poor college student, I'd really appreciate it. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.